So welcome everybody that's watching now or in the future. And this is one again in a series of interviews that I've been doing. I call Crossing the Boundary, that I have as a podcast and YouTube series. I interview people, talk to people who have crossed significant boundaries, either psychologically, ethnically, about belief systems, religiously, and in making whatever shifts they've made, how it is that they now contribute to making the world a better place. And I have today, I'm happy to introduce David Nicol, who I've been following for quite a long time. His very interesting work that parallels a lot of my own work and interests. So welcome, David. It's good to have you here.
Thanks so much, Alan.
David is the executive director and co-founder of the Gaia Field Project, also Be the Peace and Wise USA, through which he has brought together tens of thousands for worldwide meditations dedicated to social change. He's the author of a book called Subtle Activism: The Inner Dimensions of Social and Planetary Transformation, the first comprehensive study of the idea that focused collective meditation and intention can contribute powerfully and measurably to social change. He's been a teacher at CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies, the Shift Network, and the Institute for Subtle Activism. With his wife, Kate Naga, they have worked together on most of these programs that I've mentioned, and they also have a program called Web of Light, a free planetary shamanism series, and also Gayatri Circle, an ongoing weekly practice group. So to begin, I want to just read a statement about the Web of Light program. It says on the website, since October 2018, we have been weaving a multi-strand planetary web of light as energetic support and protection for humanity and the earth as we pass through this global crisis of initiation. So there's a lot to unpack in that statement, and we'll get to a good bit of it. But one thing I want to ask you about is I'm assuming that it's clear that from that statement, there's a lot in it that challenges the basic Western scientific model of reality, which basically focuses on physical objects and the actions of physical objects with interacting with each other as being all essentially that there is. So that being the standard view of reality that most of us grew up with, and I'm assuming you did, maybe you could, and take as much time as you want, talk about what it was like growing up for you. What was your family's belief systems and religious values and so forth, and what kinds of stages or transitions did you go through to arrive at this very, what some people would call very far out belief system?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah. Good to revisit that journey. Well, I grew up in Australia, in Brisbane on the East Coast, and I come from a large family, 5 kids. I'm the youngest, and my family was, a large, loving family, relatively conservative politically. I went to private schools, sort of like English boarding schools in Australia. And yes, I received, a very regular kind of Western education. So of course I, incorporated all of those basic assumptions, like you're saying, about how things are, the more secular materialist sort of worldview. The big shift for me happened when I was in my late teens. And what happened was I had had a series of a few years where I had been a real high achiever, and it'd been really important to me to set my goals, these in the sporting realm, in the academic realm, and it felt to me like this is what life was all about. And I had a lot of success in those late teen years in that world, in my studies, in my sports, but something started to rumble inside, where I started to notice that I had this pattern of being really driven toward achieving these things that I thought would be very meaningful, would make me happy. Whether it was in tennis, I was a big tennis player at the time, or in my law studies. And I had this friend who was, in contrast to me, much more easygoing, and he wasn't as high achieving, but I started to feel like, what's his secret? He seems to be sort of relatively happy most of the time. And whereas I'm really driven towards these goals, but then I started to realize I would work so hard towards them, I'd get there, and then within a really relatively very short space of time, I'd start to feel restless again. Like the satisfaction would be very temporary, like it would last a day or so. And then I'd start feeling like, I have to move towards the next mountain to climb. And something deep within started to question that process, and started to feel like something doesn't feel quite right about that. How am I ever going to attain a more stable happiness or sense of myself if I'm always driven to the next thing? And one day, for no real apparent reason, nothing dramatic happened to me in my life or external world, this awareness just exploded in my consciousness. And it manifested. I was deeply contemplating death, that I would get to the end of my life, and this awareness just landed in me that at that moment, all of those achievements would be in the past, and they would not be something that would be relevant or substantial in that moment of death. And that also included all my relationships, that I also had felt was very meaningful. All of those things would be in the past. And so it was just one ordinary Monday evening. I was in college at the time, and that awareness just exploded in me. And it was more of a disturbing realization than a breakthrough into something beautiful, at first, at least. It just disturbed the whole trajectory of my achieving self. And it went right to the core of it. It went right to the root. It wasn't just an intellectual thing. I found myself unable to distract myself in any way. I couldn't read a book. I couldn't watch TV. I almost couldn't eat, because I knew I had discovered something profound. I knew there was something profound about that realization, but it was disturbing. And so I kind of thought I was going crazy. And the only peace that I found at the time, I found myself drawn to more alternative, like new age kind of bookstores. And I would just be rifling through them. And I started to read books on mysticism. And then all of a sudden I felt like, oh my God, they're describing my experience. It was almost like a classic Buddhist awakening into impermanence, which I didn't realize at the time, right? But then I would read this confirmation from this literature. Oh, there's a whole world here about this kind of thing. And that began the search for something more enduring, something more profound as the source of meaning and happiness than chasing these things in the external world. so that was the initial shift, and then ever since then, it's been the deepening journey that's just carried me, all this way.
Uh-huh. So it sounds like that's what launched you on a spiritual quest, a spiritual seeking journey. And the books, and perhaps you started listening to people's talks that were into it, and it gave you language and gave you support to continue that journey. But still, you've gone a bit further and somehow have integrated the spiritual journey somehow with what's happening in the world and how to relate it to change in the world, a concern about change in the world. So where did that go from college years? And did you study with any particular teachers at the time?
Yeah. So obviously it's been a long, winding path. I had a teacher in Australia with the name of Leonard Jacobson, who was a really powerful, very realized teacher who initiated me onto the whole journey and initiated me into the whole world of meditation, but also more to the point, just presence. His whole teaching was about really, truly, deeply being here and now, very, very, very present. I got very connected to Osho. Leonard had been connected to the Indian teacher Osho. So I fell in love with Osho. I really had this deep, mystical connection with Osho. When I read his books, I felt like somehow he's speaking to my soul more than any other person I've ever come across. And I had this sort of falling in love spiritually with him. So did
you ever meet him or go to any of the ashrams? Or
I only found out about him about 6 months before he died. But I did go to Pune about 5 years after he passed, and I spent time 3 months there and took sannyas and absorbed the magic there. So that was a key influence. But my whole journey, for a while there, I sort of dropped out more from mainstream society. But what became clear to me at a certain point was that my path was always trying to bring a link between what I was discovering in that more profound path of spiritual growth and awakening, and a passion that I just seem to have for social political change, and in particular, the question that became a guiding question for me was, how could one take the profound magic, the profound process of personal transformation that I was experiencing firsthand, all these methods that people work on all over the world of healing and coming into unity and coming to know their deeper nature of peace and joy and all of that, transforming our ego aspects into more depth. There's so much intelligence there. There's so much wisdom there about how that happens, but usually it's focused on individuals. It's usually disconnected from what's happening in our public collective sphere. But it has so much wisdom to contribute. So what were the ways to open channels between those worlds, to create a bridge, to allow more of that wisdom to inform the process of collective transformation? So that became a guiding question. I had this sort of trajectory that I still had to play out in a sense for some time. I had that shift. I had that awakening. I was on a spiritual path, but I'm sure you know that it can work this way. There's still this sort of trajectory from our past direction that often plays out for a while. And for me, it was, I had this expectation in my family system and my education that I would become a professional of some kind. And for me, it was going into the law. So for a while, I thought maybe I'm going to find a way to create some sort of integration of my spiritual life within the law. Maybe there was going to be some place in there. So I went into environmental law. I thought that would fit my values. I became a lawyer, and it's.
Were you still in Australia at that point?
I was still in Australia. I moved to Sydney then, from my hometown in Brisbane. I worked for a land and environment court. I was a clerk for a judge there, and then I worked in a big law firm for a bit. It was maybe it was a little ambitious to imagine that I could bridge those worlds. They're very different,
Big bridge.
Yeah, it's a big bridge. And in the end, it was more seeing, no, this is not where I belong. But I think that training, it at least gave me this grounding in that world, in the, it's good intellectual training. But it was an expression of this urge to try to find some place where these worlds met. And as it turned out, it sort of spat me out, and then I ended up at California Institute of Integral Studies. That was this. So another key turn was making that move to leave the law behind, to fully commit to this new paradigm and this new way. So my life really turned around when I came over to San Francisco when I was 30, and I was in the philosophy, cosmology, consciousness program with people like Richard Tarnas and Brian Swim, the great cosmologist, Stan Groff, the great psychologist, and it was really a very, very rich matrix for a number of years, with drawing people, very, very open-minded, open-hearted people from all around the world who are coming there. It's very ambitious program about thinking the big thoughts, the big picture questions about how are we in this position? What are the world views that are informing the recreation of this problematic world that we're in? And what are more expansive worldviews and possibilities? A real mystery school, and that nurtured and stimulated my integral growth on so many levels for a number of years. And so it was out of that matrix that this direction, this path of subtle activism emerged. And I was continuing to carry that question that I mentioned earlier about, how do we create the bridge between these worlds? And in the program, I got exposed to so many visionary thinkers and seers, and I had always thought that the integration for me was going to be more in the world, more in the mainstream world. That's why I went into law to begin with. I thought maybe I'm going to end up in some sort of reform role or something like that. But what happened was a very organic process. I just kept following my passion around this, and a very pivotal event was when Dennis Kucinich ran for president. I don't know if you remember, in the early 2000s.
Sure.
Yeah, the 2004 election. These were the Bush years, and Kucinich came out with this radical worldview that spoke to many spiritually minded people, right? It was really standing behind the worldview of interconnection, and he had this very coherent platform that reflected those principles, and many spiritually minded people sort of came out of the political woodwork and supported him. It was a breath of fresh air at the time. And around that time, I was friends with Stephen Dinan from the Shift Network, and another guy, Costa Macraeus, and the three of us got together and said, how can we help to activate this campaign on different levels? And so we came up with this idea of doing a series of global meditations. And so we put that out, and that experience was very powerful. It was really pivotal. And I had heard of global meditations before. I don't know if I'd ever actually done one, but I was helping to convene these. We got a really big response. It's like we hit a vein. Yeah. We got people from something like 70 different countries around the world who wrote in at the time. It was kind of primitive internet technology at the time. It was just kind of all just through email. But when we did the meditations, it was a very profound experience, because what I was noticing was there were these three very potent streams of meaning that all collided in that kind of event, because you had the significance of a presidential campaign. Like, this is something really real, really potent, that people could understand the power and meaning of. You had a global field, because we had people from all these different countries. So that global consciousness, and then the depth of meditation. And it was like I had this experience of these three powerful streams of meaning kind of colliding in my heart and creating this big explosion of meaning, like different parts of myself sort of coming together in that event. And something turned on in me then about the power and the significance of that kind of practice, of what it could do. And so it felt like the path of subtle activism found me and led me into this clarity. Oh, this is my contribution. This is my path. It's through highlighting and mobilizing the real potential of practice itself, especially now that we have the internet that can coordinate these mass events of people from all around the world, to cohere into one field that is having a focus that's not just about personal awakening, but about helping to heal these larger issues in the collective space. And at first I was almost like, well, I was wondering if that passion was going to be a temporary thing, but once it landed, it's just deepened and deepened and deepened and deepened. Yeah. So that's how it's happened.
Yeah, beautiful. That's great. So yeah, you have really crossed a bridge there, because most folks who think about spirituality and political action, social action, and you write about this, I know, but just to put it out there, and I've also understood this very important distinction, think about it as a way to make yourself more compassionate, perhaps tap into more energy, feel the motivation to do things, but to do things basically by being part of the traditional forms of social change, political activity, maybe supporting a campaign for a president or a school board person, or protesting, or organizing, community organizing, things like that, where there's feet on the ground, talking to people, passing out literature, and that kind of thing. And that those two activities, the inner work of attuning to spirit and the outer work of making social change, there was a kind of a boundary between them. To a great extent, they were almost like two cultures where people did those things very separately and often judged each other. From when I was involved in the movement back in the early days, before I myself moved on to a spiritual path, I looked down on people who were meditating, really, because they were copping out from my point of view. And meditators often looked at me like, oh, you're just an angry, ego-driven activist, you know. But so your work, subtle activism, takes it to another dimension, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word, another dimension, but another way of looking at it, that the spiritual work itself can bring about or help bring about social change. So how does that work? How do you see subtle activism actually bringing about change?
Yeah. Well, maybe just as a prelude to that, I'll just say, yeah, I think that often the conversation is how you described it between those camps, where there's usually, the way it's understood, you have the spiritual people on the one hand who look at the activists and say, you're just adding to the cycle of reactivity. You know, like if you're not working on yourself, like what good is that? You know, and they can be really firm in that position, right? Like, and often from that stance, it's like the only real thing to do is work on yourself, you know, and then we trust that the world will change, you know, sort of as a ripple out. And then you have the activists who will say that's a cop out. That's you know, that might even be more like a privileged sort of position to withdraw yourself from these realities. And you know, we have to be in it, you know, for something real to happen. And what I'm trying to do with this work is to articulate something that is a different kind of bridge, where there is this, is trying to complexify that, you know, that difference, to say that there's a mode of spiritual work that can be done in a certain way that is profoundly engaged with healing the collective wounds on a deep level that keep us separate from each other and separate from the earth. And so I never present it as something that replaces engaged, you know, work. Obviously, you know, it's not enough just simply on its own. I never sort of say that. It's in I say it goes hand in hand with a kind of what I would call an engaged spirituality, which is, you know, the more traditional view of that, where the spiritual work helps us inform our actions to become more wise, to become more attuned, to become more loving, but the emphasis still is on the action. And there's no, I don't make any hard distinction between that and what I'm trying to do, but I'm highlighting something that not many people have highlighted, which is there is an actual deep and profound potential for the spiritual work itself, when it's engaged with in a particular way, with a particular kind of intention, and to constitute, I believe, a very crucial aspect of social change, of collective change. And
can you say something about how you see that how does it work?
Yeah.
How does the inner work affect the outer world?
Well,
other than changing that person?
Well, it proceeds on the assumption that we are more deeply interconnected than our materialist worldview would have it, right? It does proceed. It does proceed on the assumption, as so many thinkers from many different disciplines and mystics throughout time, of course, have offered this worldview that the surface appearance of separation is not the deepest truth, that there are deeper fields of consciousness in which we're embedded. And through that, we can affect each other. We are affected by each other all the time through those fields. You can think of it as in the language of morphogenetic fields, Rupert Sheldrake's work, or just consciousness fields. But this notion that on deeper levels we are connected. And so then we can explore engaging intentionally on affecting those deeper levels. And my work in particular has gone in the direction of the very particular kind of power that comes from coherent group fields. And this is where I think the work becomes a little more real or a little more tangible for people. If it's just the notion that just as individuals sending a good intention into the world for change, that's a little hard to believe that that's going to do very much. But when you have large numbers of people who gather with technologies of group coherence that bring about a very deep coherent group space, that anyone who does that kind of work, who has the experience of these bigger group fields, has this shared intuition. It seems to me so common and natural to arise from these experiences that what we're dealing with here has emergent healing properties and powers that go beyond just healing the individuals who are there. There's just this felt sense, wow, we're really connecting to something potent here. And I do this because I sort of see it as a circle. It's like this big field of compassion.
Is it more like a sphere, isn't it?
Or a sphere of love, of courage, and the intuition. And what excites me about these things is that these social political issues are so charged, we're so polarized, they're so vexed, it's so difficult to get to genuine healing. They so often go off the rails, even in very well-intentioned processes and dialogues. There's just too much trauma, there's too much baggage. And so my orientation and passion is that it's like these fields create the holding, the lubrication that's needed, the extra dimension that is needed to hold the wounds of that size, like these historical wounds like racism, sexism, separation from the earth. These are deep wounds. And so we need more and more profound levels of holding that allow, they're too big for individuals mostly, but our collective spiritual intelligence can hold these wounds, can bring transformation to them. And my belief is that when a group comes together and holds these sorts of wounds in a healing field together, that it contributes something at a deep level that is felt, that ripples out, that broader interconnected field. It's hard to prove, of course, scientifically, that sort of thing, but that's my faith, that there are good effects that flow from that go to the root of healing the wound, that not many other things can do. And so that's why I think it's got a crucial role to play.
Yeah, and it may be more than faith. It may be that you and myself included and others have an experience of that reality, the reality of what you're saying, that is, even though it's subjective, it's shared. And that's what, my friend and teacher for many years, Ralph Metzner, used to say, when two people have a subjective experience that's the same, that becomes objective.
Yeah.
That becomes a kind of proof and a kind of empirical evidence
Totally.
that
Yeah.
something is real. But I wanted to ask you another question, and that is that people in religious groups, churches and so forth, have prayed for various causes and seek to make changes on earth. Sometimes they do it for personal benefit of a person who's ill or something like that. But sometimes they do it for larger causes when there's a natural disaster and group suffering. Sometimes, however, they do it to support a war effort, and sometimes they've done it to support fascist dictators and so forth.
Yeah.
Out of maybe a naive awareness that that's God's will. So how do you see subtle activism, for one thing, as different than traditional religious prayer?
Mm-hmm.
And how are we certain we're not naive in what we're activating for, what the energy that we're putting out? What do you do to be a safeguard that it really is for the good?
Yeah, these are really good, deep questions. I mean, the way I have used subtle activism is as an umbrella term to describe, I have a pretty broad definition of subtle activism as basically just the use of consciousness-based practices for collective healing and transformation, as opposed to individual healing and transformation. So I deliberately wanted to keep it broad, just to describe this concept of how these sorts of practices, meditation, prayer, ritual, might be directed towards collective change rather than just individual change. And in that respect, I think it's really just a modern term for an ancient approach, that whether you think of it in term, like, spiritual communities engaging in prayer. There have been some Christian monasteries that have done practices of continuous prayer for the world for years on end. I would consider that a form of subtle activism. Shamans of indigenous cultures, back then there wasn't really the modern split between the public realm of politics and the private realm of spirituality. It was all sort of together, but I feel that we're building on these traditions where there were these understandings about how the actions on those subtle planes could support positive action change in the world. So I like to keep it as that, in that broad definition way that would include those approaches. But then the question of how, is it used for the good, or could it be a vehicle for something darker? And it's a very deep question. I think many people are aware that there's lots of ideas that the Nazis were engaged on occult levels, to bring through certain powers that supported their goals, but in a very dark way. And it's certainly possible. I mean, I know in my own work, we include a lot of safeguards to ensure that, for example, when I'm working with groups, you want to make sure that everyone has unconscious parts. Everyone, like we're not all light, we're all a mixture of light and shadow. And so the method that has emerged for us includes various ways of the group together intentionally sort of filtering out those parts so that the group coherence that we create is more conscious than unconscious. There's various, I think, different views too about how and where are you directing the work. Like, for instance, you could have more of an attitude where it's like your field, the group field, becomes more like a conduit for the flow of larger healing energies that come through from the earth, from the cosmos, from inner realms, from higher realms. And your field is more like in the spirit of thy will be done, or going where is in the highest good, versus being too willful about it, about go here and make this happen. I want this result in the election because I know what is the best for everybody. And
so there's always the openness to the will of a higher consciousness, the will of the forces of light that are in the universe. Is that fair to say? That
I mean, I don't have a hard and fast rule, because sometimes there might be like in the moment, or there's like, we too are part of the whole. So sometimes our own will can be infused with this clarity, and there can be this sense of, no, I know that I'm being called to direct this energy in a certain way. It's these are subtle questions I think we're talking about here.
Sure.
And
subtle activism is what we're talking about.
We're in the ballpark. Yeah. We did an event recently around the war in the Ukraine. And we've done in the last 4 election campaigns this Wise USA campaign. But in those campaigns, we are very clear about making them nonpartisan. We're not doing it to have a particular outcome. Even that's not to say we're not political beings. We have our own preferences like anybody, or I do. But when I'm holding that space, I'm very clear that what I'm wanting to do is that is then more, we are bringing through a certain kind of energy that helps to uplift the whole field, and to ask that the highest good happens. That's what I feel in integrity doing in that kind of space.
In some ways, this to my mind brings out the difference between the use of what people often call psychic powers, which usually means mind over matter, and the distinction between that and spiritual work, whether it's in a shamanistic tradition or a magic tradition. And I'm assuming from what you stand for and what you've written about and so forth, that subtle activism fits in with the notion that there is a spiritual force in the universe that we are part of tuning into and bringing forth, rather than our minds, our thinking mind, deciding somehow out of itself what it is that needs to happen, and using that power which exists to bring about change also. Like you said, maybe there are dark forces that do things like that.
No, I agree. It's not to say that there are not dangers with this. This is a power, and I think it can be used. It could be used by unscrupulous types for, to engage in that sort of black magic kind of thing. I think there's, my feeling is that when you're aligning with those greater powers, that it's so much more powerful. You have so much, that the energy that comes through that is, because it's just so much more in alignment with where the universe is going. That's, to me, that's part of the art of it, is yes, we're listening together, we're receiving the guidance, we're creating space. In my work, there's been a lot of emphasis on our field becoming permeable to the natural energies of the earth, to the natural energies of the cosmos, that it's, there's something that I think very interesting that's emerging in consciousness work about the discovery of group intelligence and group, there's an extra dimension that comes in when we join together into one coherent field. That on its own is very powerful, but when you have a coherent field that itself together comes into alignment with the earth and opens these deeper channels, so it feels like it's almost now as if it's the earth and us together that is emanating a certain energy, or it's the stars and the sun that is shining through our field, then you start to open to these very vast energies, that to me, again, this is one of the deep, profound things about the possibilities of subtle activism is to me, it's like the shift in consciousness where you can create these experiences where very large numbers of people can enter into a shared reality of our unity with the earth, with the cosmos. It feels like it's re-entering back into these more natural states of awareness that indigenous cultures lived in. And it's almost like an initiation. That's how I see my work sometimes. It's an initiation device into Gaian consciousness, that we can all have a shared reality. And that's very significant because rather than just having a private experience, going out into nature as an individual and having, a beautiful experience there, but it's just your own. There's something very significant about doing it together as a group. And again, that's what indigenous cultures did. They would do their rituals and then they would have this cultural affirmation of a worldview of interconnection. And that's what I feel like we have the possibility of doing with this. And then that changes everything, because that goes to the root of so many of the problems in our world of this sense of separation, right? So that's why I sometimes feel like this work, it's like the meta solution pattern to the meta crisis, because it all seems to come back to feeling this delusion of us being separate from.
And the very new aspect of this from traditional shamanistic cultures is that you're able to use, and people like Thomas Hubble also are able to use the technologies to have people all over the world doing this at the same time, not just a circle of 10, 15 people sitting around a fire.
Exactly.
But speaking of shamanistic work, you've written that a major opening occurred for you on your first experience with ayahuasca. Can you talk about that a little bit, and perhaps your view of how psychedelics may play a role in subtle activism, people opening to subtle activism?
Well, I was initiated into the plant medicine world through the my time at CIS and coming to North California.
Not officially.
Not officially, no.
Just the people around it, right?
Yes, just the culture. But it was a huge influence on developing subtle activism, and I think that the psychedelic experience, you started with this sense, oh, it's subtle activism. It's a pretty far out idea in the context of our materialist worldview. But just about everyone I speak to who has had an experience in psychedelics, I share the idea with, and they're like, of course, like that's the power of plant medicine work or psychedelics is most people have some experience that gives them sort of incontrovertible evidence that there are these many other layers of reality beyond what we see. And then it becomes just intuitively obvious that engaging in this way would be helpful and make sense. And in fact, it is the logical thing to do. Yeah, I mean, I had that profound first experience that I wrote about. I wouldn't say that it more was like a profound confirmation of something I had glimpsed before in my spiritual work. It was this experience of this total deconstruction of my regular self, and it was a brutal kind of process of it, like this process of it removed the veil of separation from all of the ugliest and most horrific forms of cruelty and suffering that had happened on the earth. That was the first part. It was just showing me this is real, this has happened. And so, for some reason I was brought there, and it was terrible. I
read your account.
Yeah,
I can resonate as well to experience it.
I wanted to run away. I did not want to see that. It was awful. And then it was, I was trying to make sense of it. And then it was exposing all of these parts of my identity that were sort of trying to keep it together, trying to find some hope or meaning in it, as just so much light. It was as just false. And so it's a terrifying thing. Like your very sense of self is just being stripped. And like I'd like to think on some level that I heroically leaned in and but in reality, it was just the power of the energies just pushed me through, and then I had no choice, and I was begging for mercy. And then but then the stripping away eventually just became a state of just emptiness. And then that emptiness became this absolutely profound dunking into the realm of just the silent one. And it was just, there's nothing much to say about that, It was just this sort of, wordless immersion in that place. And then eventually sort of coming out of that. But it was, it's very difficult to talk about those experiences too much, as you know, but
well, you're doing a good job.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about where we are now as you see it. Within the current spiritual scene, so to speak, there are a number of interpretations, as I see it, of what's happening right now. When
Yeah.
I talk to my friends who are somewhat in the Hindu tradition, they often say, well, we're in the Kali Yuga. That's what's going on. And, you know, the Kali Yuga, for those who don't know, is one of the cycles of the ages that somehow we go through. And the Kali Yuga is considered the darkest, the most difficult, filled with strife and discord and quarreling and competitiveness and contention. And the interesting thing about it, or I don't know if it's interesting, but the scary thing about it is if that is the case, the Kali Yuga is supposed to last for 432,000 years, and we're only 5,000 or so years into it. So we have another 426,000 years of this to go, according to that model. Now, there are also the more optimistic views, which tend to be prevalent in the New Age community, but also very serious seekers who are tuning into spiritual channels that tell us that what's happening right now is really a rite of passage and initiation. I know you tend to lean in that direction. And
Yeah.
what we're going through are the birth pangs of a new world or a new way of living.
Yeah.
I just the other day, sent a video from a Hopi elder talking about their prophecies, and they speak about this time as being one of very painful, very difficult, but it's the dawn of a new civilization where all the peoples, even the people who have been rejected, are going to be part of the family of humanity. So you are being if I'm reading you correctly, on the more hopeful side of that. What gives you that hope? What are you seeing or sensing or experiencing, intuiting?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not just fully, completely, naively in hope, in the sense that it's a very difficult time, as everyone knows, and there are real dangers that I feel. There are dystopian timelines, I feel, that are here, and you know, I feel that we need to be very awake to those dangers as well. And having said that, I do think in my deepest place that I hold that we are experiencing something of the order of the dying of an age. And of course, that is difficult. Most of our systems are now decaying and are sort of obsolete. And there's, to my mind, a kind of a desperate clutching on for control from the powers that be, you know, that are resisting that process. So, you know, death in an individual, it's a very difficult process to accompany someone through it. But the great death rebirth archetype, I think, does apply here. And one of the main, you know, I'm also an astrologer in the Western astrological tradition, and so that is the map that I'm mostly adhering to. And so in that understanding, we are in this birth canal, I believe, between the Piscean age and the Aquarian age. Then I feel like we're really in that birth canal now. And the main characteristic of the Piscean age was this sort of structure of how energy flowed that had the more top-down hierarchical structure, where a few at the top had the power and the knowledge, and most received that as a, you know, in a more intermediate way. And all of our cultural structures sort of reflected that pattern. And now we're moving to the Aquarian pattern, which is much more one of true equality and a more, decentralized networks as the fundamental organizing principle. And so part of how I understand the struggle we're in is this collapsing hierarchical centralized sort of model and the emergence of this more decentralized organizing principle. And it's a struggle. And I have some framework from astrology that, I feel like even in just a few years' time, in 2026, we're going to feel just from all 4 outer planets are going to change sign at that time, and we're going to feel a big shift in the zeitgeist. I don't think that by then we're going to be suddenly in the golden age, but one of the aspects of astrology I find helpful is that it helps you see that when you're in a particular archetypal milieu, it's very hard to imagine something different from that. It's like you feel like we tend to feel that this is now the reality and this will sort of continue on. But when the planets shift and the transits change and you're in a different archetypal milieu, all of a sudden new possibilities come in. And right now we're in a very dark archetypal milieu. We're in a very deep struggle, a very deep conflict. In a few years' time, it's going to be more expansive. And so, I veer back and forth depending on where I put my consciousness. I think, like many people, if I'm scrolling through Twitter too much, I'm feeling like, okay, we're headed for a dystopian
over the cliff, right?
Hell realm, and I think there's lots of things to be very concerned about in terms of the possibility of now a sort of AI powered, totalitarian control system. I think that's a real thing to be aware of. But I think what I feel is that as we move more and more into this Aquarian age, there's going to be just much more support for these decentralized patterns. So there's I see this as the last gasp of this sort of hierarchical control system, and eventually I think we're going to see the power of the people activate more and more. And I also see that as part of the shift into a truly Gaian age, where Aquarius also supports true equality between people. So I think a lot of this uprest at the moment is this symptom of these traumas from the past surfacing, so that hopefully we can find ways to heal them together, so that when we enter into that coming era, it's from a place of being Gaian together ultimately. And I think that requires this sort of stripping away or looking at all of these identities that have separated us in the past and healing the wounds that have happened in the past. But that's what I am working towards. Yeah, that's what I see.
Yeah. You mentioned the danger of AI, and then there's also climate change, and many folks are, many scientific folks as well as intuitive folks see there being a lot of catastrophic consequences to that are somewhat unavoidable at this point. Do you imagine that subtle activism will help bring about the kind of consciousness change that will just help us be more resilient in the face of what looks like physical difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, one of my deepest passions with the work is this one of opening, shifting the consciousness so that we return to this lived awareness of our non-separateness from the earth. And yeah, this is a really deep one, because I feel like, I think it's quite a tricky one, in that people who love the earth and feel the fear of the destruction of the earth and want to protect the earth, there's a possibility of getting caught up in a fear-driven response that I don't think in the end is going to be the way out. And my deepest understanding of it is that what's a more powerful response is going to be, it's more this shift in awareness where we can open up these channels to connecting with the creative energies of the earth, and to let that flow through us, and to listen to the earth, so that we're, I see more diverse local responses that come out of that kind of consciousness of what does the earth want when we're listening to the earth, and that the earth actually does have the path to its own healing.
As a voice, yeah, she.
Yeah. Rather than another top-down, centrally driven control system that is purporting to protect the earth, but I have my doubts, because I feel like that doesn't reflect actually nature's organic way.
It's part of the old paradigm that caused what we're facing.
Yeah.
So, David, we're running a little bit into where we want to wrap up. So, what's involved in becoming an effective, subtle activist? If somebody's listening to this, or somebody is interested in, hey, I want to be part of something like that, or I want to learn how to do that, or I want to just develop my consciousness in a way that would be helpful along those lines, what would one do?
Yeah. Well, I can offer what we do. There's I think there's many different groups now who are surfing this wave, and who there's different methods, there's different traditions, but what we offer, we have this monthly series that you announced called the Web of Light, and
you can find that, just go to Web of Light.
No, go to earthrising.one. Earthrising.one. That's our main website. Yeah. So we have this platform we call Earth Rising, this growing community, and we have people from all around the world who gather monthly. This is a free event, and this is where we're practicing this mode that I've been talking about, of creating these very profound, coherent group fields that are permeable to the healing powers of the earth and the cosmos. And then we create a very strong conduit that allows those energies to pass through into the greater collective consciousness. So we're
if
doing
somebody's
that.
never done anything like this, would they feel like, I'm not ready for that? Or
well, one of the things about this method that we found is that what happens is the group coherence becomes the group field, the group presence. It kind of draws in, it's like a magnet almost. So even if you're relatively inexperienced, it's a very tangible field. And the power of those who are really deep and coherent sort of draws in everyone from the periphery, if that makes sense. So it's a practice that it doesn't require a lot. You don't have to be an advanced practitioner. You really just have to come in with an open heart. And this is what I said, the group field is like an intermediary between us and the divine, because it's made of our essence. So you are in there, your heart, your joy, your love, your whatever, along with that of other people. And so it becomes something that's more relatable and more tangible. And it's sort of like the principle of, like, when you sit with a guru who's deep in that stillness, you can catch it. You sit in their presence and you kind of, you can more easily fall into it than when you're just on your home dealing with your own mind, right? But in this, it's like the group is the guru, the group field is the presence. And when you have 100 people who are falling into silence together and you're joining that field, it can be very easy to just come into resonance with that.
You just join in and you learn as you go.
Yeah, you're kind of guided into it. People could, if you want to learn more about the concept, you can read my book, Subtle Activism, and that's on Amazon. And we have an ongoing weekly group for people who are more wanting to go deeper, but that would be another step. But that's what we're offering at the moment.
That's great. All right, well, good. I'm glad we can put that out there, and we'll share this with other people.
Yeah.
And any last words?
Yeah.
What do you see as that can inspire some of the folks that are feeling, pretty down these days and scared about what's going on?
That's what I wanted to speak to, is we can't skip over where we are right now, and I've been myself feeling more connected to just how difficult it is right now. And I've been through my own health challenges, as you know, lately, and I'm just aware of just how many people are struggling with one thing or another. And the intensity, it feels to me like it's a spiritual war. We're really in it. But there's no sugarcoating. There's no jumping over it. But this is where I feel like there is this value of holding this perspective. It's like our compassion for each other can become a form of holding. We want to meet reality where it is. It's very difficult right now. We have to see it. We can't pretend. We can't be naive. We can't be too just in our spiritual concepts to sort of, because it's really coming at us right now. But there is this sense, this is what an initiation is. It's not an initiation if it doesn't bring us to our knees. We don't find these extra capacities if we're not pushed past our edge, so it's not theory anymore. We're really in the initiation. We're really being pushed. And one thing that I do say is that we can at this point both contribute something at any time, which is we can all contribute to this broader planetary field of holding, this sense that there is a subtle layer of that connects all people who have that deeper experience of silence or peace or unity or love, that there are threads that are being woven around the earth through those experiences. And we can, consciously decide, if you're meditating, to offer your presence, offer your peace to that broader field, with a sense that at least I can do that, and that can create some holding, can contribute to this layer of support that helps us go through the collective initiation. And you can also draw from that if you absolutely need it, if you're feeling really in despair, to connect with all those people now and in the past who have added to this field of love and unity, and you know, realize that that is a thing, that is part of the earth, and breathe it in and feel like, even if it's as hard as it is, there's some holding there. That's subtle activism. So that's what we can do.
All right. Well, thank you, David. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and inspiring and helpful, I hope, to many people.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks so much. Thanks for creating the space.